Hello, good morning. Welcome to all St. Andrew's YouTube worship and reflections. This is our midweek reflection and the second in a series on the liturgical life and worship and music life of the Episcopal Church, giving some more background to those who may want to learn more, or a refresher for those who have experienced it for years. Last week we talked about the Book of Common Prayer and looked through it, and particularly some parts that you may not see on a weekly basis. And this week we're going to look at some of the worship supplements for the Episcopal Church, and there are many. You may know or remember that the last approved Book of Common Prayer that we use in our worship regularly, and the one that you see, the red cover in our pews, that is dated 1979, and there have been discussions in recent years about when and how to update that version and come out with a revised Book of Common Prayer, which often has happened every kind of 50 to 100 years in the life of the Church. And for now, that discussion is ongoing, and instead of taking the step of revising that prayer book, so far, what the liturgical commission in the Church, in the Episcopal Church broadly, has decided to do is to issue smaller supplemental books that provide updated services and liturgies without revising the core prayer book. Now, they may well still revise that core prayer book at some point. It's just taking a lot of negotiation and effort. As you can imagine, that book, as people grew up with it, and it's cherished in many ways, and people love the language, and it's so familiar. The reason to update it, though, that is given is several things. One is to provide some more inclusive and expansive language. It's stripping out a lot of the masculine language for God, for example, and replacing that with kind of gender-neutral language, or at least some masculine and feminine images to balance that out. So that's part of the discussion. There are also lots of liturgies that perhaps weren't thought about in that 79 prayer book. So examples are liturgies around childbirth, like a prayer, a litany for a miscarriage, or for those who are not able to be pregnant and would like to, or the loss of a child and certain kinds of illness or accident or whatever. Those weren't kind of conceived in the 1979 prayer book. Other examples are liturgies around how we think about same gender marriage, which again is not conceived in the 1979 prayer book. It's just between a man and a woman. But now we, in the Episcopal Church broadly, and certainly we at St. Andrew's, recognize and celebrate the possibility of marriage between same gender couple. And so that has been another kind of supplemental liturgy, not yet in the prayer book, but available and authorized fully for use. So let's look at some of those supplements. The first supplement, the kind of the longest standing one, is this one. It's called the Book of Occasional Services. I have the 1994 version, but there's actually a 2018 version that I need to get hold of probably. But this one includes a lot of, first of all, a lot of seasonal blessings and services. So sometimes when we add a special blessing for Lent or Advent or Christmas at the end of a service, it comes from this book. It also has the kind of rough framework for the liturgy of the lessons and carols that we use in Advent, and again now in Christmas. That opening bidding prayer that I think is particularly beautiful comes from this book, and then an outline of what lessons are are recommended with carols interspersed. There's instructions for how to do the Maundy Thursday foot washing and how to strip the altar and so forth that are traditions at St. Andrew's. And then there are a series of services in here, sort of like what I mentioned around childbirth, around preparing people for baptism, around anniversary of a marriage. Those are all in this book of occasional services. There's a commissioning liturgy for lay ministers in the church, whether vestry members or altar guild members or other lay volunteers, and we've used that from time to time. There's a service for blessing and dedication of church furnishings like vestments or new altar hangings and so forth, and we've used that one when we got some new altar hangings a few years ago. There are liturgies for blessing a building that was a different type of use and now has become used by a church. So think of like a storefront church might want to bless that space in a sacred way as it becomes a church. There's also a blessing, kind of a restoring, blessing of restoration for in an example of a church building that maybe somebody has been attacked or experienced a violent attack there, or the fire burned it down, or a flooding or whatever. You kind of, when you go back and kind of restore a building to its use and sanctify it and bless it, and we've seen that used in a few different ways over the years. And there are many more. So that's all in this book of occasional services, which was sort of the primary supplement for a while. Then, more recently, there's a whole series of supplements under the title Enriching Our Worship. Enriching Our Worship. And these started out primarily focused on that gender-inclusive language that I mentioned a moment ago, and different imagery and ways of capturing a God beyond those masculine imagery that is so traditional. And so that's this is an example of enriching our worship, and you see that it includes various prayers for morning and evening prayer and for Holy Eucharist that expand that language and that imagery around God. And we've used those from time to time in our worship, prayers here and there, and including in our outdoor evening worship that we have been doing this last month or two. There are 5 or 6 or 7 different of these Enriching Our Worship booklets. I have 3 or 4 of them. So some other ones are ministry with people who are sick or dying, and ministry with children who are sick, and then ministry around childbirth and childbearing and loss of children. And again, a lot of these are things they didn't conceive of previously. I mentioned some earlier. Another example that's in here, there's a litany for removing life support from someone. So all kinds of different liturgies that speak to our lived experience, times of joy and times of great sorrow. And it's the church's effort, the church's attempt to provide frameworks of prayer for those moments, that we might gather, a pastor and a family, or gather as a church, and invite God's presence into those most tender moments in our lives. So that's the aim with all of these liturgies. Another one that I have in my office but couldn't find is there's a whole book devoted to that same gender marriage liturgy, and you may remember that there was a different liturgy put forth for that context, and that was actually right before the decision on marriage equality. So it was briefly sort of blessing those relationships before they were legal, and then when they became legal, it became an alternate choice for the marriage liturgy, and so it's just it's not like between man and man or woman and woman. It's just gender neutral. It just talks about the people as individuals rather than in gendered language, and it's really beautiful. I would encourage you to find it. It's available on the diocesan website, or I'd be happy to send it to you. And it uses the theology of covenant in describing the promises and vows, the covenant we make as two people pledging their lives and their love to one another. And the theology of that is really compelling in a kind of a different and a deeper way than the 1979 marriage liturgy that we're all familiar with, has been in our book for years. So it's an interesting alternative in its theological basis that it chooses for relationship and for marriage. So, and a couple other things as we wind up for today. There's another book called Holy Men, Holy Women, or Holy Women, Holy Men, Holy Women, Holy Men, Celebrating the Saints. And it's a book that goes through the calendar year and the different saints' days that we commemorate in the church. And for each one, there's a book that describes the person, describes their life, and then also gives some kind of prayers and readings that are relevant for them. So here I just flipped open to one. This one is for Phillips Brooks, who is a great preacher in Boston, the rector of Trinity Copley Square, and also wrote O Little Town of Bethlehem, I think, which is one way that he's known. Anyway, you can see the prayers and reading, suggested readings, and then a description, a bio of his life and impact in the church. So there's an example of this book, which again we occasionally use to inform our services and our preaching. You may know that one of the beauties of the Episcopal Church is that we're part of the broader Anglican Communion, and different provinces, basically countries or regions throughout that Anglican Communion, have their own versions of the prayer book. And I've always found that beautiful because in one way, we know that around the world we're sharing roughly common worship and similar prayers on any given Sunday in dozens and dozens of different languages and contexts and cultures, but the kind of ties us together. The other hand, another beautiful thing about that is each one has its own unique kind of language and approach and set of prayers that reflect that context. So I've got a handful of them. This one is from New Zealand, which is one of the best known and kind of most interesting and innovative prayer books in the communion. I've also got one from South Africa and got one from England, and maybe another one or two. And so it's interesting to kind of collect those. And so right now in our outdoor service, we're using one of the Compline prayers or night prayers from this New Zealand prayer book to incorporate that as well, just because it's such a beautiful prayer and it seemed like a nice time to include it. So those are some of, and there are many others, but those are some of the liturgical resources available to us to kind of broaden and deepen our worship. And if you'd like to learn more about any of those or borrow something, please let me know, and keep an eye and an ear out in our worship for ways that some of these sneak in there from time to time, especially on our creative worship, our fifth Sundays of the month, when we can get back to those and highlight some of that diversity from time to time throughout the year. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next week for more. Bye-bye.